think we are live on YouTube. Thanks for everyone watching. I'm Emily Walker with the U.S. Embassy Algiers, and you are tuning into our chat with a diplomat with special guest Marwa El-Zeini. I'm going to allow her
we are live on YouTube. Thanks for everyone
here in just a minute. But first, want to tell you this talk is sponsored by the American Cultural Center Algiers, or the ACCA. We are the kind of cultural space / library / resource room / area for interesting talks that's in the U.S. Embassy in Algiers. We are one of several cultural centers around the country of Algeria. We also have one in Ouargla, Constantine, Béchar, and Oran. So if you're in any of those cities or in Algiers, I really encourage you to check out our cultural centers. Once the coronavirus pandemic has abated, we'll start reopening things, and we hope to see you in person. But until then, we're doing these talks online. So I have for you today a special guest who is a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy. Marwa El-Zeini, she currently serves as the consul at the U.S. Embassy in Algiers. She's been in this position since 2017. She's worked with the U.S. Department of State since 2007. She served in Mexico, the United Arab Emirates, and in Washington, D.C. In her work as a consular officer, she's overseen visa operations and services to U.S. citizens living in or visiting Algeria. Before joining the U.S. Department of State, Ms. Zeini worked as an attorney in Orlando, Florida, where she practiced family, business, and immigration law. So that's sort of her brief professional background, but she has a very interesting backstory. So I'm going to turn this over to Marwa. If you could kind of tell us about your upbringing, where you were raised, and how you came to be working for the U.S. Department of State.
Of course. Thank you for hosting this, Emily. And I am very pleased to be doing this talk today. Yeah, a little bit about myself. So I was born in Egypt, and my parents left Egypt actually when I was 2 months old. So I never lived there. My parents were both doctors. They came from large families, and they were looking for better opportunities overseas. So initially they went to the Gulf, and then my father went to Scotland to pursue a PhD program there. And so for majority of my teenage years up till the first year of college, I actually lived in Scotland. I grew up there, and then my father went to the United States on a work visa, and we eventually as a family all immigrated to the United States. So I've been in a couple of different settings education-wise. When I went to the United States, I had finished my first year of college in Scotland, and I went into college in the United States. The systems were very, very, very different. In a lot of ways, the United States allows you in college to pursue a lot of different opportunities, to take a lot of different classes. And so I, while pursuing my computer engineering degree in the United States, I took a computer law class. And that got me really interested in law and the legal system in the United States. And so after graduating with the engineering degree, I went to law school. In law school, I got married shortly before then. I had a child in the middle of law school. And then I moved from the university town I was living in, and started actually working as an attorney in Orlando. Initially for a big law firm as a corporate attorney, but I very quickly learned that that wasn't really my passion or my interest. And so I decided to open up my own law practice in Florida. That was shortly after 9/11, which was a very difficult time in the United States for everyone who was really living there. It was difficult in terms of the confidence that was shaken. As US citizens, our confidence was really shaken as to our vulnerability to others. And it also was difficult as a Muslim living there. A lot of support from my co-workers, from my neighbors, and so on, but a very different shift in the rhetoric with regards to how people viewed our community, our American Muslim community in the United States. So I opened up my law practice, and for a few years I practiced law and did all types of civil law, basically. Anything that walked in that wasn't criminal, I handled, but mostly family, immigration, and business law. And then I looked around and I really thought I need to have a broader reach. I need to be able to reach more people. I want to contribute something more to the world. I don't want to be living in a small community and just servicing that small community. I want to have a broader reach and help in developing the understanding between the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the United States. And so that's when I started pursuing this opportunity to join the State Department and go down the path of becoming a diplomat.
Can I ask you, how did you know about being a diplomat? Was this something that you knew somebody who was a diplomat, or how did you hear about the career?
No, so I didn't. And as I said, I was looking around for something where I can make an impact. And I did a lot of research. So I looked at, the United Nations. I looked at Foreign Service. I looked at the various non-governmental organizations in the United States. And for me, with the set of skills that I have, I thought that the greatest impact would be joining the State Department. And in the town that I lived in, the university actually had a diplomat in residence, a person who is a former diplomat who is stationed at a university and recruits people to join the Foreign Service. And so I had some long discussions with the diplomat in residence, and really she pretty much sold me on the idea of the Foreign Service.
So this talk is more getting to know you, and maybe less about exactly what consular services are at the U.S. Embassy, mostly because we're closed to the public right now, so that could be a talk for perhaps at a later date. But could you talk a little bit about what being the consul at the embassy entails, and just generally what consular services are?
Of course. So consular services around the world, we have really three main missions. The first is the protection of US citizens overseas. And we can see that in times of crises like these, where we are providing emergency services to our citizens, whether that be where do I get medical care, or how do I get repatriated to the United States, or I've been a victim of crime and I need help in navigating the legal system in the foreign country that I'm in. The second part is to the visa operations, whether that is non-immigrant visa or immigrant visas, and making sure that we facilitate legitimate travel to the United States while still ensuring the national security of the United States in adjudicating our legal system and our legal immigration programs. And then the third thing normally is the planning and managing aspects of that whole operation. So even when we're not providing these services, we are always doing contingency planning. So we plan for disasters, we plan for pandemics, we plan for things that might happen in the future to make sure that we are prepared, at least nominally, when something strikes, so that we can provide the services that are kind of needed.
Thank you. Well, we have a question from someone watching on YouTube. Haoum Fati wants to know what it was like for you transitioning from being a lawyer to being a diplomat.
So as an attorney in the United States, it's what's called an adversarial system. And so you're always fighting, right? You're taking one person's side, and you're always thinking of arguments, and you're always advancing that person's point of view. And you're always thinking of what people are going to come at you in terms of cross arguments and so on. As a diplomat, you're doing something completely different. As a diplomat, you are trying to pretty much represent your country overseas. You're trying to make sure that you are providing the best service that you can, and you are trying to do so diplomatically, with making sure that your points get across, but in such a manner that they're effective, right? And so there are certain skills that you learn as an attorney that are very useful in that. But I think the mindset is a little bit different. You're going from an adversarial, always in a kind of confrontational manner, to a very different mindset of being a diplomat and trying to negotiate your way through things.
Interesting, thank you. Another question from YouTube from Martha Asma. She also wants to be a diplomat, and she wonders if you have any advice on where to start. I don't know.
So where does she want?
I think she might be Algerian. So say if somebody wants to be a diplomat in their home country.
So I'm not sure what the process is for an Algerian diplomat. I know the process is very different in the United States from a lot of countries. In the United States, to become a diplomat, you go through a series of tests. So there's a written exam that you take, and then you go and you do an oral exam, which is basically an interview. And then you go through clearances, medical clearances, security clearances, suitability clearances, and so on. And that process can take quite a bit of time. And it requires some persistence on your part, really. You can't give up at the first go, at the first time that you take an exam. You have to be patient, because some of these steps take a long time, and you don't have a lot of control over how long it's going to take. What I would say is, wherever you are, if that is something that you are interested in, set a goal for yourself, make a plan, and determine how it is that you can reach that goal.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit more about what you just said? Maybe more specific about goal setting. I mean, how do you use that in your own life when you have a goal? Do you have a literal list and you try to go through to mark these things, or what's your process for that?
So I've evolved over the years. I think this nomadic life of moving all the time has forced me into making lists. In general, I try and look and see where I want to be in the future, right? And then look at that, have a vision for myself, a vision for my family, a vision for my career, and so on, and prioritize it. Because, I don't live in a vacuum. Different times in your life, you have different goals, you have different responsibilities that you need to take on. And so I try also not to go too long, right? And so I usually go 2 to 3 years in the future and see, what is the goal for my next tour, my next assignment. And then from there, what do I want to do? How does this fit within my family dynamic? Is this something that is going to be suitable for me, for my spouse, for my child? and then kind of make a plan around that.
Thank you. I have a question for you. When you were doing your intro, you talked about the difficulties in the United States around September 11th, and said that a lot of things changed for Muslims in America around that time. You said you both had some positive experiences and some maybe unsettling experiences then. I'd love to hear a little bit more about those experiences.
Sure. So one of the things that I fell in love with when I first got to the United States is I never felt like I was a foreigner when I first got there. And so I had lived the majority of my life outside of a country that I was a citizen of. And American people are a very welcoming people. And so the question in the United States, people were always curious, where are you from? Where do you come from? But they never had that follow-on question, which I had in other countries, which is, when are you going back, right? Because everybody assumed that you were there and you were there to stay and you were there to contribute and you were now part of their society. That attitude, that very welcoming attitude to everyone in general was something that I really, really appreciated in the United States. I think with September 11th, what happened was, because the perpetrators of the terrorism acts were foreigners, that attitude changed a little bit. People became more suspicious of people in general. My sister, who was 3 years old, she was in daycare or in Head Start, and one of her friends turned around and said, "Why did you do that to us right after September 11th?" And my sister, who's 3, didn't even know how to answer a question like that, right? But that is a reflective of the kind of messages that 3-year-old who was in class with her was hearing at home. And so I think the attitude changed a little bit, and it's taken, part of it was also the Muslim American community. We were very insular in that we did not, a lot of us are very highly educated. We are in the service professions, we are doctors, we are engineers, and so on. But we tended to keep to ourselves. We tended not to open up our mosques to let people in as often. And I think after September 11th, we learned that lesson, to open up a little bit more to society, to better integrate, to better show what the contributions that we are making to society really were, and that we were part of this, and that this incident was as painful to us as to everyone else in the United States. As I said, there were some really positive things. So at the time of September 11th, I worked for a large law firm, and my colleagues actually escorted me for weeks on end down to the parking lot because they were afraid for my safety. When I would walk down the street with them, they're the ones who would notice the looks I was getting. I had become desensitized to it, but they're the ones who really would notice that. And so there was a lot of kindness, a lot of solidarity with a lot of Muslims as well. But I think that's one of the things that we learned is, if you knew a Muslim, then you had less of a negative view of them than if you didn't, right? Because all of your messaging was then coming from the TV and from negative news stories. And I think that's in general the case. We are always looking for the odd. We're always, the news is never, what's normal. We always hear about the incidents, the violent incidents or the unusual incidents. No one is playing, you know, this is your normal neighbor and they're doing their normal thing. That doesn't make the news. What does make the news is the violent acts and the unpleasant experiences in general.
Thank you for that. We have a few people asking to know maybe a little bit more about your life as a Muslim, both in the US and living abroad. Difficulties, delights, anything.
Well, so life as a Muslim in the United States, there's actually a lot of Muslims in the United States, and we are a very diverse population. We have Muslims who are from African American descent, who constitute a large part of the Muslim community in the United States. But because the United States is an immigrant community, we have Muslims from all over the world who have immigrated to the United States and have now set up in the United States. And depending on where you are and how small or how big that community, you may be, you know, interacting with a very diverse community, or you may be interacting with just a community that is from your background. And so in the college time that I went to, there was just one mosque initially. And that meant that, you know, the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims and the African Americans and everybody was worshiping in the same space. And we were able to share in the things that are joint between all of us, and share that space and make that a communal place where we celebrated Ramadan, where we did our prayers and so on. In larger communities, when we moved to Orlando, there's a little bit more of a comfort in, for example, the Arab-speaking immigrant community having their space and being able to do their worshiping in Arabic versus the South Asian community wanting to do their worshiping in Urdu, for example, and so on. And so it depends where you are, what your experience is going to be, but we have a very diverse population. We have diversity in thought, we have diversity in backgrounds, and so that makes it a very unique experience. So one of the things that always surprises me when I serve in another country is seeing how undiversified their population is in terms of Islamic practice, right? Because I'm used to Islamic practice from all over the world and accepting that. And I think in a lot of places, because they are usually following one version of Islamic practice or one school of thought or so on, it's very, this is the way we do it, and everything else may be incorrect or we're unfamiliar with. So that is something that is kind of unique to the population in the United States, the Muslim population in the United States. The practicing Islam overseas is also an interesting. So in Mexico, we lived on the border between the US and Mexico. So the town we were in actually had no other Muslims. And so a lot of, and they hadn't come in contact with a lot of Muslims either. And a lot of the old ladies would actually think that I was a nun. Because of the way that I was dressed, and they would say, "Bless you, sister." And you know, I'd be doing their visa interview, and at the end, I'd give them a decision, and they think I'm a nun, and I'm thinking, why do they think a nun is doing the visa interview for them? But it was a very interesting, you know, possibility. There was across the border in the US town a mosque, and so over the weekend we would go and interact with the community there.
And Marwa, did you speak English from the time you were very young, or how did you come to learn English? Was it just spoken in your home? So.
No, so I spoke Arabic until I was about 7. And that was the first time we kind of went to Scotland. And I was very grateful for the Scottish education system. They taught us English using cards. So they would put up the picture of a dress and say, this is a dress. They'd put up a picture of a ball. This is a ball. And then they went through the whole storybook curriculum from 0 to whatever. And so within the space, me and my sister, within the space of 2 to 3 months, we were actually pretty fluent in English. And so I was grateful to have learned it that way. I think it's an organic way of learning. It did not require translation. And so, but it also meant that English and Arabic for me were 2 distinct languages, and it's taken me quite a bit of time to be able to translate between the 2, because they're not languages that are linked to each other.
Did you also learn Spanish for your job in Mexico?
I did learn Spanish for my job in Mexico. And I have to say, my confidence in languages is not great. I was able to learn Spanish, but I understand it now. I don't speak it as much. I learned French coming out here. I don't use it as much. Again, I understand a lot more than I use it. But yes, I did. I'm part of it is because of the way foreign languages are taught, you're always concentrating on the grammar and whether or not you're making a mistake. Whereas the way I learned English when I was younger, that didn't matter, right? When you learn a language organically, you make mistakes and people will correct you and you move on with your life, and you're not worrying about it. I think part of it as well for me is I'm expected to use this language for the job I'm doing, to be professional. And so I don't want to sound like I'm an uneducated person or making elementary mistakes. And so that's a little bit of a challenge sometimes.
For our listeners, you might not be able to pick up on this, but Marwa has a really beautiful Scottish brogue. She speaks English with a Scottish accent. From her time learning English in Scotland and living in Scotland for many years. Siham on YouTube wants to know, how many languages do you speak?
So I speak Arabic, English, French, and Spanish. I can't claim French and Spanish well. And I took German when I was in high school, but German and Latin when I was in high school, but that was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot. Another question for you is, let me see, this is from Nora on YouTube, and she wants to know what advantages women diplomats have compared to male diplomats.
Interesting.
Interesting.
I think we bring a different perspective. I think again, it depends where you come from and what your position is and what your job is. But I think in general, women in the workforce bring a different perspective than men in whichever job they do. I think we have to have both. I think we complete each other. I think sometimes, I am able to read, and this is me personally, I don't know if it probably has nothing to do with a woman, but I'm able to kind of, especially with some situations that involve sensitive issues, so domestic violence or some of the parental kidnapping or some of these things, I can put my diplomat hat on, but at the same time, I can put on my female hat on, my mom hat on, my spouse hat on. There's a lot of different hats that I kind of wear. And all of these perspectives inform the way I'm going to handle a situation. And I think it's the same for male diplomats. They also wear different hats, whether they are, you know, a consular officer or a political officer, whether they are in a relationship, outside of a relationship, whether they are parents or not, whether they have parents or not that are living, and so on. And so each of us has a whole set of identities that they bring, and that informs the way that they're going to handle a situation.
And I'm sure you use your background as a lawyer very often also, which is another hat.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
We have a question about how Ramadan went for you this year. Did you cook shorba and borek?
So I have yet to learn how to make borek. But I have to learn before I leave. I have made shorba. Ramadan was a very interesting experience. My family is actually back in the United States, so Ramadan was just me here making food for myself. And if anyone has done Ramadan, you are very hungry, so you make a lot of food, and then you actually eat very little of it because your stomach has shrunk at the end of the day. And so I would cook maybe once a week because I had so much leftovers that I was just likely eating leftovers for the rest of the week. So, but it was a very different Ramadan. I was able to connect with my family back in the States. Definitely, we didn't have the opportunity this year to do what we normally do, which is share iftar with other people, do tarawih at the mosque, all of these things that we are used to doing in Ramadan. But I think it also made me reflect on, you know, that I can do this on my own. You don't need all of these wrappings, all of these things that we're used to actually perform the fasting or the prayers or the things that reconnect with God.
Speaking of food, you've lived in so many different places. Some of them are very known for their food. Are there some regional dishes that you still like to make or that you crave a lot? What are your favorite foods from where you've lived?
So I've enjoyed the food in almost every place that I have lived. I grew up, my parents were of an Egyptian culture, so I tend to, the food that I tend to cook is very Arab-centric, but I also got the spicy bug from Mexico, and so I enjoy Mexican spicy food. The Emirates was just every type of food available in the world was available in the Emirates. And I think Algeria also has some very, very unique dishes that I have enjoyed tasting and experiencing. I am sad that there aren't as many Algerian restaurants as I would like to be able to experience more Algerian dishes, and kind of have to rely on my Algerian friends to make them at home for me, just because they're not as available. But that is something, food is always something that I enjoy in whichever place I go.
Thank you. Another question here. This one is from our own Nadia in the ACCA. She would like to know, what are the skills that a diplomat needs to have to be successful in her job?
So you need to be adaptable and flexible. You need to be able to understand the person in front of you and try and determine how both of you can reach the goals that you want to reach, or how both of you can benefit each other so that everyone wins in a situation. I think you need to be able to handle surprise very well. As a diplomat, I land in a country that I have never been in. And the first day on the job, I'm expected to be able to carry on whichever position I have intelligently and sensitively. And that has to do with perception, being able to perceive what the other person is thinking and feeling. It has to do with experience. It has to do with the ability to navigate foreign cultures and be able to see what is good in every culture that you encounter.
A question from Martha on YouTube. She wants to know, do you have a role model in the diplomatic world? And if not in the diplomatic world, then I'd be interested to hear who some of your role models are in general.
So I've worked with a lot of great people in my career in the Foreign Service. One of the earliest role models that I had was in my first position in Mexico, the deputy principal officer, who later on went to become an ambassador. She was an amazing role model. And she, one, was very attentive to everything that was going on. Although I was one of many, I was one of maybe 40 people who worked in that section, she made me feel as if I was an important part of that, that team from day one. She actually came and visited me in my house before I even turned up for the first day of work. She had to make a lot of difficult decisions, and a lot of times, especially for women, when they make difficult decisions, sometimes the perception is they're hard, or they are, so women are either perceived as too soft or too hard. It's very difficult to be in the middle or the right kind of person a lot of the time. And so she had inherited a shop that was very difficult, and she made a lot of difficult decisions management-wise. And sometimes that came across as harsh, but in the end, I think she had done the correct thing. And I think when I was in Mexico, we had an incident where one of our colleagues was actually murdered by the drug cartels. And that's when I actually knew how amazing this role model of mine was. She pretty much was able to be the chief mourner, the chief person who is grieving, but at the same time led the team, made sure everyone got the grieving services that they needed, but at the same time was able to continue with the important work that we all still had to do. There were still American citizens that needed our help, whether or not we were grieving for our colleague or not. And so she was able to lead us through that difficult period of time. And I was really very impressed by her. And so I have met a lot of people throughout my career, but I think she was the person who really, as a first tour officer, on my first position in the Foreign Service, she's the one that has made the most impact for me.
Thank you for that. And what an intense experience having one of your colleagues murdered by a drug cartel in Mexico. I'm very sorry, that's very intense. So your job at the US Embassy also, I can imagine, can be intense in a very different way. How do you kind of deal with, people are coming in, perhaps wanting a visa, they really want to go to the US, it can be very emotional. How do you sort of deal with this emotional aspect daily? Does that take a toll on you? Do you enjoy this?
I think I enjoy the work that I do, and part of it is I understand the reasoning behind the decisions that we make, right? We are a very law-abiding society. We are a democracy. We agree to a set of laws, and these laws, until changed by Congress, are the laws that we all abide by, right? And so that is one of the bedrocks of our system in the United States. And that means that I don't get to make a decision because I like the person or I dislike the person, right? It means that I am bound by a set of reasoning. It means that I can't be influenced because this person is this person's son, or this person is a high-ranking official, and so on. And so I serve in a lot of societies where that is not the basis for making decisions. And so that always puts me in kind of a difficult position, because again, you're a diplomat, you are trying to get things done, you are trying to achieve US policy, but at the same time, you do have to follow the rules and the regulations that you have. And so for me, I am always trying to see how best I can serve the person. And so no matter what decision, the most important thing for me, no matter what decision the person gets, my number one concern is that the person is treated well, their story is heard, and they are given a fair review of their case. And at the end of the day, they get a decision based on the law of the land. And so it's really important. Customer service is really important to me. So people coming in feeling that they are heard, that they leave with their dignity, even if the decision is not in their favor. And so that's something that I really feel is extremely important. And I was on the other side of that interview window at one point. I went and got a visa, and I remember a consular officer, not the one that handled my family's case, but another consular officer who berated applicants. And I know how difficult that is. And I never want any applicant that comes into my consular section to feel that way. And so that has been something that is a focus for me. It does take a toll on a consular officer if they are continuously having to say no to people. I mean, we are by nature as human beings, we want to say yes, right? We want to always be positive. We want, if we can make something happen, we will. And so have some compassion for our poor consular officers who are making these decisions based on the law that they have at hand, and trying to do that as politely and as painlessly as we possibly can.
Thank you. We'll just have time for a couple more questions. Shurak on YouTube wants to know what you majored in college.
Sure. So my undergrad was in computer engineering with a minor in history. And then I went and I did Master's of Business Administration and law degree. It was a combined 4-year degree as a graduate student. So those, a lot of different subjects right there.
Is there any recommended major if one wants to be a diplomat?
You know, in the United States, there really isn't. I think I have met diplomats from all walks of life. And I think each person brings a different perspective to the table, depending on what their background is. So I think the important thing is to have the skills necessary to be adaptable and flexible and be able to negotiate and all of these other things that we talked about, rather than a particular major. Again, I think for me, you know, I learned something from every single degree that I did, right? So computer engineering, I learned to take big problems, bring them down into small parts, and then build them back up into a whole, right? As an attorney in law school, I learned to think both sides of an argument. I learned to see other different perspectives. And so I think as an MBA, I learned how to manage, right? And so I think for me, that set of degrees actually helped give me the skills that I needed to be a diplomat. But I don't think there is any one degree path that will get you there.
Thanks. And for a final question, could you share some of your impressions of Algeria? What were your impressions when you arrived? And now after you've been here for 2 years, has anything changed for you?
So one of the things that really impressed me about Algeria and Algerians is how kind they are and how honest they are in their dealings. So I've been in a lot of places where if you're perceived as a foreigner, that's an opportunity for someone to take advantage of you. And that is not something that happens here. People, the minute that they find out that you are not from here, they kind of think of you as a guest in their house, and they welcome you in, and they are happy to share their experiences and happy to talk to you and happy to tell you their life stories and so on. And nothing has really shaken that impression for me. The other thing that has really impressed me about Algerians is their language abilities. Every time I see an Algerian speaking fluently between you know, French and Arabic, sometimes English, sometimes, you know, Amazigh, I'm always like extremely super impressed by Algerian language ability. And I think they have amazing young people with a lot of potential and a lot of ambition. And they really want to make something. I have seen so many young Algerians who have taught themselves English, have taught themselves skills that they would not otherwise have. They're not waiting for someone to teach them something. They are going out and actually achieving those goals. And so I have really, this country has really impressed me in these ways.
Well, Marwa El-Zeini, thank you so much for your time. As a reminder, Marwa was the consul at the U.S. Embassy Algiers. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much to everyone who's watching on YouTube. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, the U.S. Embassy Algiers YouTube channel, by hitting the subscribe button. And we hope to see some of you in person in the future. Thank you.